Lean on, O King eternal, your blessings I'll accept. But don't ask me to suffer, it's not what I'll accept.
Hi, and welcome back to another lesson in the dangers of cat theology. We are looking at the dangers that result when we see ourselves as the main character of the Bible and of life. So far, we have discovered that we are constantly looking for ourselves in the Bible. Once we find ourselves, we celebrate it and stay focused on us. Then, out of all the passages that speak about us, we only pick the ones that make us feel good. Well, that leads to the third danger. And that danger is this: we have selective application. Many years ago, I was at a meeting with all of the leadership of Frontiers, an agency that does church planting in the Muslim world. I was on staff with them, and there were 10 of us in that meeting. And to help us become better leaders, they brought in a leadership expert who was going to try to help us become better leaders. He started off by asking the question, did God have a plan for Abraham's life? The obvious answer was yes. Then he said, did God have a plan for David's life? Again, the obvious answer was yes. Then he said, did God have a plan for Moses' life? The obvious answer was yes. Then he asked the key question, does God have a plan for your life? The obvious answer was yes. At this point in time, I began to feel a bit uncomfortable. Something was wrong inside my spirit. Finally, I raised my hand and I said, excuse me. Isn't it a bit arrogant of me to think that I'm at the level of a Moses? He was one man who led an entire nation. And you've got 10 of us here in this room. We can't all relate to Moses. Only one of us can. What about the other 9? And then I asked the question, how do I know I'm not supposed to relate to one of the masses living under Egyptian captivity as a slave that Moses rescued? You see, I felt more comfortable relating to the slaves than I did to Moses. Now, not only do we just want to relate to Moses, but if we have to relate to the masses, we only want to relate to the generation that got free. Think about it. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, we learn that the Hebrew people were enslaved for 400 years. If one generation lasts 40 years, let's say, 400 years divided by 40 gives you 10 generations. 10 generations lived as slaves. And where do we focus whenever we want to learn anything about Israel's slavery in Egypt? We focus on the one that got free, and we declare, God wants us free. There shouldn't be any bondage in the church. Hey, what's got you in bondage? Is it drugs, alcohol, pornography, workaholism, financial problems? Don't stay there. God wants you out of it. He freed the Hebrews. He wants to free you. Now, does God want to free us? Well, absolutely. It's not incorrect, but it is incomplete. If you haven't figured it out by now, our set was designed to be an incomplete set. That's why the cat is half there. That's why you've got shelving with books that are missing. It's an incomplete. Why? Because cat theology is incomplete. Well, why is that lesson incomplete? Because there were 9 other generations to learn from. Now, let's ask ourselves a very simple question. Did God love those 9 generations in slavery, yes or no? The obvious answer is yes. Let's ask another question. Did God have a plan for their lives? Again, the obvious answer is yes. Well then, what was God's plan for their lives? He wanted them to be born as slaves, to live as slaves, and to die as slaves. That's 90% of the lesson to be learned from Israel's time in Egypt. But with our feel-good theology, we skip right over those lessons. Why? Because they don't make us feel good. And if life is all about us, we'll only accept lessons that allow us to feel good. Hey, listen. When was the last time you heard a lesson in the church on the idea that God wants you to live, eat, and die in slavery? Probably never, I'll bet. Why? Because it won't make you feel good. It won't make the people in church feel good. And they'll probably turn away and leave the church, so it's not preached. Why aren't we taught lessons like, your siblings are going to sell you off as a slave so God can use you in a foreign land? Could that be taught? Sure. Just look at the life of Joseph. How about this lesson? God may want you to marry a person from another culture just so you can bond with your in-law and be shown kindness after your spouse dies. This could be taught from the book of Ruth. How about, you are to be a prophet, be jailed, and see no fruit for the majority of your years of ministry. That was Jeremiah's life. How about, God might want our country to be invaded, devastated, to get the gospel outside of our home country. This can easily be learned from God bringing other nations to invade Israel and Judah to disperse them to the nations as a form of judgment and to get the gospel out to the nations. How about, God may want you thrown into a blazing fire to show His power. That lesson was learned from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. From Daniel, we could teach, God may want you taken from your home forcefully to become a leader in another country and then be cheated and thrown into a lion's den. From Abraham's life, we could say, God may want a famine to come to your land, so you move to another country and share your faith. Or how about, God is going to test you by having all your assets taken away, by having your children killed and inflicting you with severe pain, the story of Job. Or why don't we teach the lessons from Paul's life? God may want you beaten with rods, stoned, shipwrecked, naked, cold and hungry, alone at sea, beaten with 39 lashes multiple times, put in jail to share your faith with others. Why don't we commonly teach these lessons? Because they violate a cat's feel-good theology. And if it's all about people, then we never want the people to feel bad. Nor do we want people to leave the church, because if they leave, where will they get training in godliness? As a result, we do not teach these lessons. But that puts us in a no-win situation. If we preach these hard lessons, many will leave, and if they leave, how will they hear the good news and be trained in godliness? But unless we teach these lessons, they'll never truly know what it means to live for God's glory. So, do we teach the lessons or not? But let's ask a tough question. Why did God allow any or all of these things to happen to His people? Wasn't He worried about His people leaving? Well, since it's not about people, that's not the right question to ask. God did these primarily for one reason, so His glory could be revealed in wonderful and awesome ways. God knows that if His glory is first and foremost in all things, people will follow and worship Him. Hence, His greatest concern is in revealing His glory. So, how is it revealed? In the Egyptian slavery, the people learned a valuable lesson for future generations. Be kind to the internationals living around you. Wow. Think about that. God may let something very difficult happen to you just so future generations can learn a lesson. When I taught this lesson at a college, one young man immediately got up and left the room. Why? Because his Christianity was all about him, and he never wanted anything like that to happen to him. He would not yield to God's will in his life. Well, what about the other lessons? I hope to you it is obvious why the Lord allowed Joseph to be sold as a slave to Egypt. He ended up saving not only his people, the Israelites, from a famine, but the Egyptians too, along with others. God is into revealing His glory through saving people. And Ruth's marriage to Naomi's son allowed God's glory to shine through the kindness of Boaz. Jeremiah's faithfulness, despite years of fruitlessness, put God's glory on display in an amazing way. And Israel's dispersion allowed God's justice to prevail, showing the penalty on a nation when it sins. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't even need to be discussed, as God's glory shone through saving them from the fire. And Daniel's life is a testimony to God's faithfulness, saving us in our times of trouble. The famine of Genesis chapter 12 allowed Abraham to be the first ever missionary sent from God, though he did not go voluntarily, nor did he do a very good job. But this revealed God's missionary heart for all peoples. And Job's life testifies of God's glory through God's holiness and unquestionable ways. And of course, the Apostle Paul's life declares God's amazing power through one man who was completely given his life to God. Listen, life isn't about us. We may have tough times come into our lives, but God is in control. And He is wanting us to be looking for one key thing. Where is God's glory shining in this? Now, could we literally ever apply any of these lessons to our lives? Let's take the worst case scenario. Becoming slaves. Would God want us to become slaves today? Listen to the story about some Moravians who knew life wasn't about them, who knew it was about God and His glory. 2 young Moravians heard of an island in the West Indies where an atheist British owner had 2,000 to 3,000 slaves. And the owner had said, no preacher, no clergyman will ever stay on this island. Even if he's shipwrecked, we'll keep him in a separate house until he has to leave. But he's never going to talk to us about God. I am through with all that nonsense. 3,000 slaves from the jungles of Africa brought to an island in the Atlantic, and there was no one to tell them about Christ's love for them and death for them to set them eternally free. These 2 Moravians were in their 20s when they heard about these slaves. They did something about it. They sold themselves to the British planter for the standard price for a male slave. Then they used the money they got from their own sale to buy a ticket to go to the West Indies. That cheap atheist planter would not even transport them. The Moravian community came to see the 2 lads off, who would never return again, having freely sold themselves into a lifetime of slavery. As a member of the slave community, they would witness to these precious slaves about the love of God, about Christ's death for them, about eternal salvation and eternal freedom that they could have. Family members were very emotional, weeping as they saw them leaving on the ship. Was their extreme sacrifice wise? Was it necessary? As the ship slipped away into the tide and the gap widened, the housings had been cast off and were curled up on the pier. The young men saw the widening gap. They linked arms, raised their hands, and shouted across the spreading gap, "May the Lamb that was slain receive the reward of His suffering." Yes, these are tough lessons to learn. But once learned, we are free to serve God, even into slavery, to serve God in any way that will bring Him His greatest glory. Don't settle for selective application. Read the Scriptures. See what has happened to others and ask yourself, am I willing to let God do this in my life? If you can answer yes, you are well on your way to living a life that brings God His greatest glory and brings you your greatest joy.
I'll live for you as long as I'm happy and I'm blessed. Lean on, O King eternal, just give me happiness.